Yeah, the rest of them won't be shown. Cool.
Hadn't noticed, so we're going entirely against my personal grain, and we're going to start about 3 or 4 minutes later than 7 o'clock. I am known for starting on time. However, those of you in the room, you will be warmer if you are toward the front and closer together, and that will also make it easier for Dr. Woodley to be in conversation with you. So in that 2 or 3 minutes before we start, if you're not in one of the first 3 rows, would you please move forward? Okay, 5 minutes past the hour is the most that I can tolerate. Good evening to those of you in the room, to those of you on the live stream, and to those of you who are watching later. Welcome to the Iliff School of Theology, located in Denver, Colorado, and serving learners around the globe. I'm Kathy Kelsey, the Vice President for Academic Affairs at Iliff, and I'm delighted to share in this time together with you. Iliff School of Theology, founded in 1892, acknowledges that the space in which we gather today is located in the traditional and ancestral home of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples. Because we are also a geographically diverse group gathering today, I invite you to pause for a moment as those streaming into this event to also acknowledge the peoples in whose ancestral homelands you are currently standing or sitting. The forced removal of the Cheyenne and Arapaho has caused devastating impacts that the Iliff School of Theology cannot undo or fully rectify. But we are responsible for and to in our occupation. Our occupancy has historically ignored the relational significance of this land and all of its peoples, both human and non-human. We also recognize the enduring relationships that these nations have to their homelands. Through this acknowledgement, we pledge in our learning community to listen to learn from, and to amplify the wisdom of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples. In addition to our land acknowledgement, we publicly affirm our commitment to the Lenape peoples, with whom we have entered into an ongoing process of accountability and building right relationships. The intertwined histories of Methodism and Euro-Christian conquest were exemplified by Iliff welcoming the gift of an 18th century book of Christian history bound in the skin of a murdered Lenape man and displayed as a treasure at Iliff from 1893 until 1974. We seek to address this horrific legacy through attention and sustained effort to reshape Iliff's relationship with the Lenape and other indigenous people in our teaching and in our communal life. This evening, the Everding Lectureship is generously sponsored each year by a bequest from Lee Everding in honor of Iliff's very first Dean of the Faculty, Dr. Ed Everding. Lee's purpose in founding the annual lectureship was welcoming the public to hear from scholars who explore the many dimensions of interfaith relationships between major traditions, particularly those which trace their roots to the patriarch Abraham. The lectureship is a cooperative project between the Episcopal St. John's Cathedral and the Iliff School of Theology. It includes lectures at both the cathedral and at Iliff, as well as a course for master's students at Iliff. It continues to enrich Denver, as well as all of those of you joining us online, live and viewing the video. We remember Lee Everding with great gratitude. Our 2024 Everding lecturer is the Reverend Dr. Randy Woodley, widely known for his deep passion for creativity and indigenous spirituality, justice, and earth empowerment. His diverse background and experiences have uniquely equipped him to bring about positive change in his communities for over 3 decades. Dr. Woodley is an award-winning author and a tribally recognized Cherokee descendant, United Ketuwah Band, who weaves indigenous wisdom, ecological sustainability, and spirituality, weaves them into positive change. He's respected by indigenous and non-indigenous communities worldwide and has been featured in the New York Times, PolitiFact, Time Magazine, and the Huffington Post. Dr. Woodley is the author of a dozen books and over 30 chapters. His book, Becoming Rooted, 100 Days of Reconnecting with Sacred Earth, is critically acclaimed, and his book, Indigenous Theology and the Western Worldview, was voted a top 10 book of the year by the Academy of Parish Clergy in 2022. Randy and his wife, Edith, co-sustainer, he calls her. Edith is Eastern Shoshone. Randy and Edith have founded and co-sustain Elohe Indigenous Center for Earth Justice and Elohe Farm and Seeds, a nonprofit teaching farm that seeks to foster equity and justice between indigenous peoples, the land, and the wider society. Through their organization, the Woodleys have tirelessly worked to educate and raise awareness about the unique challenges faced by indigenous communities and others. Their approach is deeply rooted in their expansive experience and creativity, using teaching, activism, storytelling, art, and music to bridge cultural gaps and foster understanding. Welcome, Dr. Woodley. You've been here for a few days. It's fun to be able to welcome you to the podium and to have you help us think with you about impediments to peace in a wounded land. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you, Kathy. It was wonderful to be here on this very, very cold night. Some of you probably stayed home because it's so cold out. I was thinking of doing that myself, and but it would have been a very short lecture, I think, if I'd have done that. So I'm going to need someone, and I realize we're starting just a little bit late, but someone to tell me when an hour is up. Who would be willing to do that? So, and you'll have to really get my attention. I'm not very good at this. You can see I'm not wearing a watch. I don't see a clock in the back of the room. Stand at my side. Okay, I want to have time for discussion, Q&A afterwards if we can. So I just want to, at an hour, I'll start to wrap it up, hopefully, if we're not done before that. It's kind of like the, I don't know if you heard the story of the young parish clergy who was assigned to the reservation, and he looks down the street and he sees this old man standing in his yard, this old native man, and he's got his arms crossed like this, and something's moving in his arms. And so he walks down the street to see what's going on. And apparently the guy was holding a goat in his arms, and every now and then he'd take a bite of the hedges. The goat would chew, and then he'd take another bite. And so this parish clergy says, what are you doing? And the old man says, well, I'm trimming my hedges. He said, don't you realize how much time that's going to take? And the man just looked at him and said, what's time to a goat? So I'm kind of like that goat. Somebody's going to need to get my attention, right? So, well, today, this is all, what do we call this? This is like the merch page, I guess. But these are just some of the things that if you want to follow up on anything that we've done or who we are. We also have a seed company and some other things we're proud of. I'll talk to you just a little bit about what's going on there. I try to throw my biases out. I have hidden ones I don't know about, but at least you kind of get an idea of sort of like how I understand myself. But mostly, I just want you to know that I know how to grow corn. So, and this is a Cherokee dent corn. It's about 9 feet tall, but it gets to be about 13 to 14 foot tall in Cherokee country. So, but these are just some of the seeds that we preserve, a lot of indigenous seeds to make sure that those never go out. This is my co-sustainer and my wife, and she's right here in the back, and she is and we are at least equal. She's probably more like it's 60-40. She's 60, I'm 40 of what we do out there in the farm. And these are just some of the crops. This happens to be, by the way, an 800-year-old squash. Now, they don't look that old, right? The seeds were found in a cave in Wisconsin, and they figured that the clay pot that the seeds were in was about 800 years old. So they sent them to Canadian Mennonite University in Canada, in Winnipeg, which is about the same degree as this right now, I think, in Denver. And they grew them out. And then I had a friend who had a friend, and he was able to get me 9 of those original seeds from or not original, but the second generation. And I think this is the 3rd or 4th generation that we grew. And this is an incredible squash or pumpkin. It's kind of a combination between the taste is between a sweet potato and a pumpkin, and it's just rich. You can tell how rich it is with vitamins. And that's the kind of thing that we're trying to do, is just preserve these kinds of things. And so, and these are our core values. Everything on the earth is sacred. We seek harmony and cooperation with people and nature. We believe in community. Humor is a big thing, and story are essential for learning. And we must all be liberated from a Western worldview. So that kind of gives away my purpose here today. Climate crisis requires an urgent response. That's not the only crisis we're experiencing. When I gave the title, how long ago was that? So long ago. Yeah, I knew we were living in a wounded land, but it just keeps getting more wounded. And so today I want to be able to talk to you about, like, yes, we have a present crisis, but that present crisis is perhaps evidence of a crisis that happened about 530-something years ago, and I want to talk to you about that. So anyway, Iliff is a farm, a seed bank, a learning center, and we've been teaching for about 40 years Native and non-Native peoples how to, their commitment to preserving humanity's role as good earth keepers and understanding Creator's invitation to harmony and shalom. Through cohorts, camps, ceremonies, conferences, and schools, we offer an opportunity for all to learn a new way to live on the land and respond to the climate crisis. And it just happened to, by surprise, Gregory is here. Gregory was showed up at the last minute here. We walked in, and he attended one of our Iliff schools, and so I was really happy to see one of our former students come out. Yeah, these are very meaningful pictures, you can tell. The bottom right is a kind of a cool picture because you can't really see it all, but there's like mailboxes, and I think he was wearing a Timex watch and the big thing. It's sort of like, you know, I hope we're surprised by what we hear about Native America today. So, 95% is a number that I want you to remember during this whole presentation. It's a pretty important number to us in Native America, but it should be important to all of us. So 95% are the Native Americans who were lost in the first 110 years of contact. 95% of our population, one of the largest calamities the world's ever seen, about probably 20% of the world's population during those 100 years. So pretty startling. 95% is also the buffalo who were killed. 95% of the beaver are gone. 95% of seed diversity since 1900 is gone. 95% in our valley, 95% of the wetlands in the Willamette Valley, which is a large valley, are gone. If you love the redwoods like I do, 95% of them are gone. And tall grass prairie, 95%. So that's a number that we need to remember. And as we think about that, we think about just 5% of all of those things and more left. And we wonder if we are in a crisis. This a reconstruction of a Cherokee village is Old Tellico. And that was one of my grandfather's villages, my third great-grandfather. And this is a great reconstruction. It's now completely underwater because of the Tennessee Valley Authority. It's under the Tennessee River. CO2 is being released in the atmosphere faster than any time in the past 66 million years. That's trouble. But it's not like we didn't know about it. So this is an article from a 1912 New Zealand paper. And it says the furnaces of the world are now burning at about 2 billion tons of coal a year. When this is burned, uniting with oxygen, it adds about 7 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere yearly. This tends to make the air a more effective blanket for the Earth and to raise its temperature. The effect may be considerable in a few centuries. Well, it didn't take a few centuries. It just took less than 100 years. This is the average temperature in Colorado by year from 1950 to 2100, so you got some projection here. This is the global average temperature. Of course, that says 2023 was the hottest year since records began, but actually 2024 now, we know, was the hottest global year on record. And so I want to take a look back and sort of see what happened. So we want to look back at Western Europe in the late Middle Ages. And these are some of the characteristics. They're not the only characteristics, but these are some of the characteristics. The deforestation, war, topsoil is depleted, oceans and bays polluted and fished out, rivers and streams undrinkable. Maybe it wasn't such a bad thing because beer became the main drink after that, right? Air pollution makes breathing unhealthy. Disease killing tens of thousands, and large mammals are going extinct in Europe at the time. Classism reigns. Cities are overcrowded. People are living in poverty, corruption and greed. There's the top 1%, and everybody else sort of like hopes they have a good life. Hunger, disease, war, economic depression. And this should sound relatively familiar because it came with them. And why did it come with them? The same worldview came. Just a few more facts. I know we know a lot of these things, but it's good to remind ourselves. About 2/3 of the world is experiencing desertification. By 2050, over 1 billion people in the world will be displaced by desertification. Plus, we also have others who are displaced because of climate change. And just ask the people in Florida, the people in North Carolina right now, some of the people in Southern California. Poor land leads to poor people. The way we feed ourselves is one of the culprits because we've lost a relationship with food. Topsoil could be gone in 60 years. And then if you can, on April 22nd, pull out your phones and mark your calendars, there's a film that's going to be streaming on Prime. It's called Common Ground, and it's about regenerative farming. And we were able to be a part of an early showing and be on a panel to talk about that. It's an incredible film, and I hope everybody here gets to see it. It gives you hope. So we say that we're in the age of the Anthropocene, and I'd like to give it a different name because it's not just humans who cause this, it's a particular kind of human. And that kind of human comes basically out of the industrial age of Europe. And so I call it the Europatricene. And a couple of people helped me get there. Developing it was European elite who developed a distinctly mechanistic view of matter, an oppositional relationship to nature, an economic system indebted to geographical expansion. And then to understand, Vandana Shiva also tells us that modern science has a worldview that's both supported by the socio-political economic systems of Western capitalist patriarchy, which dominates and exploits nature, women, and the poor. And so I think Europatricene is a better name for the era that we're living in, and it gets to the root. Gus Beth, former dean of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, made a profound statement. He said, "I used to think that top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that within 30 years of good science, we could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we as scientists don't know how to do that." It's a very profound statement. It's not that we need more knowledge. We have lots of knowledge. We just have to make the correction. To aid that is the myth of progressive civilization, like, oh, well, we're going to figure this out because we're more progressive than the people in the past, right? That's sort of how we tend to think. Like, we're going to come up with a solution to this thing, right? As if the people in the past, didn't know anything, but we do. John Mohawk is my favorite author. He says, "For the most part, contemporary historians have proceeded from the presumption that modern people are different from and superior to those who came before, especially those designated as primitives. Distortions and incomplete and even dishonest renderings of the past are found in many modern accounts of ancient peoples and contemporary primitive peoples, quote unquote primitive. These accounts serve to reinforce the sense of difference and to distance moderns from unflattering legacies of the past." By the way, that's Colorado Springs there. America and War, and I'm not going to go through all these, but if you'd like to just a minute peruse that, starting on the bottom and working your way up, or starting on the top and working your way down. In my book, Shalom and the Community of Creation, I actually go through this in some detail, but basically there have been very few wars or years where we didn't have war in America, in the United States, like on this continent. We've been at this for a long time. Someone had said, America is not at war, America is war. And so I ask, who are the primitives? Now, I always get this, right, during the Q&A period, so I'm going to circumvent that. People have been trying to take each other over since time immemorial, right? Not true. And so I want to introduce you to a study, if you don't know it, of James DeMaio. He said, the debt of, well, let me start with the title. Evidence drawn from history, archaeology, and anthropology speaks clearly the quote-unquote New World prior to Columbus was far less violent place than the Old World. The debt of modern society to the indigenous peoples of this land is huge, and a scientifically grounded appreciation of Native American culture reveals the largest region of planet Earth where the larger percentage of humans lived peacefully so late into the historical period. Learning from America's First Nations can only make the world a better place. DeMaio focused much of his life's work on the study of indigenous societies and their relationship with violence compared to peoples of the West. His work explores the cultural and social factors that contribute to violence in these societies and even divides it along male-led and female-led cultural divisions. DeMaio looked at how societies view potential solutions to reduce violence and promote peace and build inclusive communities. In other words, how to develop and how to maintain harmony. This is the conclusions that he came up with. 1, human violence is unnatural. 2, perpetual war is not inevitable. 3, the human species is by nature loving, cooperative, and peaceful. There's a real early peaceful period in the archaeological record. Number 5, the concept of the naked ape or the violent genes is a modern fantasy and falsehood. Early climate change was the cause around 4000 BCE to lead widespread appearance of violent human societies. And 7, and this is probably the most important that I'd like to stress, matrix societies, those with greater female influence, are much more likely to resolve conflict that could lead to war than patrist societies, those with greater male influence. And I know many of the women in the place are just going to themselves, well, we knew that. So DeMaio's life work is the largest and most extensive of its kind. He studied 1,170 indigenous societies in Africa, Circum-Mediterranean, East Eurasia, Oceania, South America, and North America. In North America, where we all live, only 29% of tribal groups held patrist values, so roughly 1/3, with only one group having what he called extreme patrist values. While of the 69% matrix, not matrix, sorry, misspelled, societies, 166 tribal groups in North America held extreme matrist values. I wonder what that means. And how many have read the 698-page? There you go, all right. I found one person in all my talks. Yeah, it's an incredible book, and you know, it's not without controversy. But these folks, and archaeologists and anthropologists, come together, and their conclusions basically parallel DeMaio's. And I wanted to summarize a 700-page book, but I couldn't in anything that would fit on the screen, and so I just took the last paragraph. And they said, bureaucracies that work on a community scale, cities governed by neighborhood councils, systems of government where women hold a preponderance of formal positions, or forms of land management based on caretaking rather than ownership and extraction. Look at Minoan, Crete, or Hopewell societies, not as random bumps on the road that leads inexorably to states and empires, but as alternative possibilities. Roads not taken. After all, those things really did exist, reminding us that people did actually live in those ways, often for many centuries, even millennia. We could have been living under radically different conceptions of what human society is actually about. It also suggests that even now, the possibilities for human intervention are far greater than we're inclined to think. Very hopeful book, if you buy the premise, which is the premise that I'm trying to sell you tonight, by the way. So I'm going to tell you a story. It's a Cherokee story of how disease and medicine came to be. I'm going to get a drink first. It's just strong tea. So we're told the story that a long time ago, the Cherokee people began to sort of kill animals indiscriminately. And they weren't thankful, they weren't grateful, and they took the best parts of the meat and then they left everything else there. And so the animals, they got upset about this, and they decided to hold a council. And so the animals came together and they said, you know, what are we going to do about these people? And someone said, well, how are they killing us? They said, well, bows and arrows. So, okay, well, let's make some bows and arrows. And so the bears led the meeting, and the bears got together, and they started making bows and arrows. But they found out that they couldn't aim very well because they had these big claws, right? So someone said, well, you should cut your claws off. And they said, no. If we do that, we can't make a living because, like, we dig for grubs and stumps and the ground. And so what are we going to do? And so the rest of the animals, and that includes the insects and the birds, and this is the whole animal kingdom. And they said, let's find someone else to lead us. And so the bears, reluctantly gave over. And so they decided that it would be the inchworm that led the council. And so the inchworm is sitting on a stump, and the inchworm starts querying, what do you think we should do? What do you think? And started getting the input from everyone. And they came up with these ideas. Well, let's put disease on the people, and that'll teach them a lesson. So they thought of all these diseases. They thought of smallpox, and they thought of, chicken pox, and the mumps, and the measles, and, all these different influenza and different things. And they started putting them on the Cherokee people. And the people began to die. And as I recall the story, it went like this, that first the small children began to die, and then the old people began to die, and then the men started to die, and then even the strong women began to die. And at that point they said, well, we're not going to be a people very long. We're in a crisis. We have to do something about this. And so they went to the animals and they begged for forgiveness. Please, we'll act differently. But the animals said, no, we don't forgive you. And so all this time, as people continued to die, the plant people were watching what was going on. And the plants held a council, and they decided what they would do is, because they felt sorry for the people, and they began to send plant remedies in the dreams of the Cherokee people as to how to cure them. And so each one would get a different medicine in their dreams, and then they would begin to heal. And so they all came back together, the people council, the plant council, and the animal council. And they decided on some things, but it was mostly the responsibilities of humans. And so the human people said that they decided that they would first, before they go out hunting, they would sing a hunting song. And they would ask an animal to give it itself up. And if you saw an animal and it didn't clearly give itself up to you, you weren't allowed to kill it. That was what the song was about. And then when you did take an animal, the first thing you had to do was to thank that animal for giving its life. And then you had to put tobacco on the ground as thanks to the earth and reminder that you took something from the earth and now you need to put something back. And to give thanks to Creator for providing it all. And they had to use, the second thing was they had to use every part of the animal for something. And that was the decision that the plants and the animals, what I call the whole community of creation, came to. And there's some things that I hear in that story. The story tells me, one, how to relate to creation. We learn from our mistakes. We don't keep making the same mistakes. We learn from them. We allow creation to teach us. We keep the balance of the whole community of creation in mind. And we maintain gratitude in ceremony. Stories are an interesting thing, and this is actually inaccurate. And I couldn't find my slide earlier because I one time presented this to the story to the faculty at Portland Seminary. And afterwards, both Old Testament professors came up to me and they said, we want to talk to you. And I'm like, oh, what did I do? And they said, your figure's inaccurate. And I said, what is it? And they said, 90% story, not 75, 90%. But I can't find that chart. So I keep using this one. So, yeah. Kim Bailey said this: if theology is expressed in concepts and structured by philosophy and logic, the primary tools required are a good mind and the ability to think logically. But if theology is presented in story form, the meaning of story cannot be fairly ascertained without becoming as much a part as possible of the culture of the storyteller and his or her listeners. the West has still not caught on to how to understand story. I would remind you that the people who wrote these stories in Scripture were not postmodern, modern people. They were closer to probably an indigenous worldview and understood what the meaning of story actually is. Someone in the class today, one of the co-learners, quoted Richard Rohr, and I loved it. And do you know the quote? But you just love Richard Rohr, right? He's a wonderful man. And I think the quote was something like, if anybody remembers it, you can correct me. But and there she is, Christina. Thank you. Okay, could you stand up and say it real loud so people can hear? All the stories are true, and some of them really happen. And so, and I talk about, it's not the truth of the story that makes the difference. It's the truth in the story, right? That's why people tell stories. And so we need to rethink sort of how we understand that. And here's how I look at, for example, the first 11, 12 chapters of Genesis. Creation is, and because the Genesis stories are so often melded together, right? We know they're two separate stories, but they're so often melded together, so I just kind of melded them together here. Creation is in harmony and in balance. The trees, if there's an original sin, maybe the original sin is the misuse of land as Creator intended. That's what I get out of the story. That there's these things that you're supposed to eat from, and this one you're not. And so they misuse the land. Disharmony in ecocide and leads to broken relationships, blame, marginalization, subjugation, and ethnocide. And you can follow that story throughout the first chapters of Genesis. And so I want to talk about this relationship, that's this correlation between ethnocide and ecocide for a moment. So Western European society treats creation and people, especially women, the cultural, racial, gendered immigrant other, and the poor, and nature, of course, in much the same way. To objectify nature, women, the poor, the cultural, racial, gender other, to control them, to exploit them, to expect production from them, and to serve at one's pleasure. Does that sound like our society? So this relationship with the land and violence against people have this relationship. So the American myth that carries these stories, I want to just look at that for a moment. It problematizes the other. It has a central meta-narrative. It universalizes its own meta-narrative. It embeds itself in all systems, history, theology, family, economics, etc., education. It subordinates anything contrary to the myth, and those who are different are traitors or unpatriotic or you name it. And one example is Native Americans. We can be terrorists, we can be noble savages, we can be mascots, but never quite fully and equally human in the American myth. Western Christianity promises, according to the Western mind, a future hope. Salvation, development, security, civilization, equality, freedom, prosperity. But what has been delivered to our people and many other peoples is imbalance, oppression, violence, and destruction. And I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so don't worry about that. But this is what we have experienced as a people. And I believe it's 530 plus years of the Western worldview that came from Europe to here, the Europatricine, that's really behind all of this. And I'm going to explain why. So I believe the Western worldview is a failed experiment, and it's time to abandon it. So worldviews carry undergirding factors that lead to a conquest mentality. From Europe, the three assumptions, at least, that the universe is mechanistic, that humankind is the master and that humankind is qualitatively different from all forms of life, all other forms of life. But we're all indigenous from somewhere. I'm going to say that again. I'd have you say it with me, but I'm not sure you really want to. But we're all indigenous from somewhere. You know, most of us have forgotten because another worldview has sort of been replaced that indigeneity. But somewhere deep, you know, our ancestors knew how to survive working with each other and with the land. And they are indigenous. So, as Edith and I look at what we do, we say, well, we're not the real farmers. These 200 billion bacteria and 20 million protozoa and 100,000 meters of fungi and 100,000 nematodes and 50,000 anthropoids in one handful, one good handful of good soil, they're the farmers. So our job is to keep them healthy. So we're what we call regenerative farmers. We believe that that is directly out of our own tribal stories and the Genesis story. That our role as human beings is to be caretakers, or another way we like to say it, co-sustainers with Creator and the rest of creation. And we are nothing but, well, we are more than, but we have 39 trillion microbial cells that influence our well-being in us. We are basically walking earth. And so we're talking about our relatives. We talk about good soil and the rest of the creation. Functionally, to be human is to be a co-sustainer of the literal earth. To keep harmony in the world, the whole community of creation, to be indigenous. We're all called to be indigenous co-sustainers. That's our purpose. And maybe you don't keep a farm and keep the soil and keep seeds and those kinds of things. Maybe you do something different. Maybe you, I had a shirt earlier today about missing and murdered indigenous people. Maybe you're involved in that. Maybe you're involved in, you know, educating people to do these things. Maybe you're involved in bringing water to people who don't have water. Whatever it is that you are doing as a co-sustainer, you are functioning in your human capacity and the purpose you were made for. We're all indigenous from somewhere. We were born to be indigenous, and I like, in my book, Becoming Rooted, if anybody's looked at that, don't skip the introduction, as many people do often in the books. The introduction, I must say that 7 or 8 times. I'm trying to get across the fact that we are all indigenous in some way, form. And I make a difference between a small I and a capital I. So small I originating or occurring naturally in a particular place. Large I of a people inhabiting or existing in a land from the earliest times from before the arrival of colonization. We're all born to be indigenous, but we're not raised in the Western worldview to be indigenous. All of our indigeneity has been stolen. Not just Native people. All of the Western worldview has taken it from us. There's a tribe in Northern California. I've been to their ceremony. It's called Pikyavish. It's the healing of the world, or fixing the world ceremony, they call it. And they come together and they fast and they dance and they pray and they feast and they sing, and they do this every year since time immemorial to heal the world. They won't stop because they believe the world still needs healing. Ancient indigenous American civilizations and European civilizations. I try to compare apples to apples, and some people argue with me, but I would propose that Native America was much healthier, more tolerant of diversity, more in tune with the environment. We utilize thousands of medicines, foods, and drugs, including over 60% of what the world now calls food. Hospitality, inhospitality was barely known at first. Just the people of the center, Karl Starkloff, said, on reading various accounts and monographs by explorers and anthropologists, what strikes one is the almost universal hospitality shown by Indian tribes, especially to their white visitors. Because that's part of our values. And indigenous peoples everywhere, a lot of them have these same values. Ben Franklin, who I'm not wild about the founding fathers, but my 30-year-old son said to me the other day in some other context, he said, Dad, if Ben Franklin were alive today, I think you and him would be good friends. I'm like, well, okay, I like him better than the other ones, for sure. But he said, when an Indian child, he was more honest, when an Indian child has been brought up among us, taught our language, and habituated to our customs, yet if he goes to see his relations, there is no persuading him ever to return. When white persons of either sex have lived a while among them, though ransomed by their friends and treated with all imaginable tenderness, in a short time they take the first good opportunity of escaping into the woods, from whence there is no reclaiming them. I wonder why. So part of the myth of America, and I usually go into, there's a long thing, and when I teach church history, the first thing I say to my students is, there's no such thing as history. And they look at each other like, am I in the right class? And I say, there's only histories. And the second thing, the first day of class is called America Before Columbus. And we go through all these wonderful things, and we show these architectural drawings and all this, none of which I've brought tonight because there's just not that much time. And I talk about all the inventions and the technologies and the large cities of 40 and 50,000 and the different ways that people moved water and all these kinds of things. And in every class I've ever taught, after that session, someone says, why didn't I learn all this? I mean, I'm in a master's program. Why didn't I learn this in my undergrad? Why didn't I learn this somewhere else? And my answer was the same every time. You weren't supposed to learn this. Indigenous peoples learn naturally from childhood forward that all things are related to one another. It takes dualistic thinking and extrinsic learning to create artificial categories of reality. In time, these categories themselves become the realities. Disintegration occurred in the West as a result of Platonic dualism between mind and flesh, spirit and body, material and ethereal. Disintegrated worldview has the advantage to be able to concentrate in depth in one category. It's a gift in some ways, many ways, but its deficit is the missing relationship of the categories to all other things. In other words, we have, whether it's science or whether it's education or whether it's the medical field, we have all of these wonderful specializations, which that disintegrative thinking is actually very helpful. But the problem is that we often work out of those areas, those specific areas, as if they are the whole of reality. I call it putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. So I call this 530 plus years of observation and the big duh. Indigenous peoples, to indigenous peoples, the problems of a Western worldview are obvious. The way of life demonstrated by Western peoples leads to alienation from the earth, from others, and from all creation. It creates a false bubble called Western civilization, in which the West feels will protect them from calamity if they maintain homeostasis. This false hope is built on age-old philosophical ideas handed down from Greece, Rome, England, and other Western empires. And so my question has always been, what can turn the people who call themselves by Christ's name into people who will kill, steal, and destroy people, land, and nature with a genocidal passion? Why is that? So I began this journey, and I'm not going to go through the whole journey with you, but I tried to educate myself, and like many people of color, probably every person of color has asked themselves this at least one time in their life, if not daily. Why are white people like this? Right? But I don't really think that's a good question. And so I tried to educate myself beyond that. And then I, was spending time finding out, well, what is whiteness? What's that about, And I have a whole bunch of books I could recommend to anybody who's interested. But, and then how did whiteness come to be? And then finally, I began to understand that there was a worldview, a reality, that was a particular understanding of reality that created this whiteness. It doesn't have anything to do with individual white people. It has to do with a Western worldview that created whiteness. This chart is not so important. It's in one of my books. I just want to compare and understand, and you to understand that Native American people have few, if any, beliefs. So, and in the Euro-American religious reality is mostly beliefs. And I'm going to try and explain why I think that is. So I've asked a number of elders at different times because to test this out, what are your beliefs? And what I get is stuff like, well, I believe being a good husband. I believe in being a good father or mother. I believe in helping out people when they need help. None of which are what we would call beliefs. They're just life, right? They're living. So we have 3 character statues up here. We don't really know what Socrates said because all the stuff was burned, right? But we know what Plato says Socrates says, so hopefully he was being accurate. If I ask you who the sort of top 3 philosophers in the world are, most of us would name those 3. And why are they important? They said many great things, but they also started something which I will just name Platonic dualism, and a lot of us know what that is. And then because this dualism, this privileging the ethereal, mind, spirit, etc., over the material world, body, earth, land, that got to be, and if, I know we're in a highly educated crowd, but we can reduce this down to just saying, like Plato said, that a thing is not really a thing. It's what you think the thing is, right? And I don't know that he meant to start a world movement. We have the whole Plato's cave and all of that kind of stuff. But he did, and here's how he did. He taught his star pupil Aristotle, and he had a sort of own take on this. And Aristotle also is sort of, we call the father of modern racism because racist theory, because he began to sort of categorize people in hierarchies, right? So people are gold and silver and bronze, and of course, whoever thinks of that and sees that thinks of themselves as the top, right? The gold, And so Aristotle teaches that, and then he has a particular young student that he spends time with, and his name was Alexander. Last name the Great, if you haven't heard of him. Yeah, and Alexander takes this idea of Greek philosophy and architecture and poetry and art as the highest form of civilization, and he spreads Hellenism across what's mostly the whole known world at that time. And so that's what's happening. So that's where Platonic dualism really gets marketed, right? And then as things die down after many, many years, we have something called the Renaissance between the 14th and 17th century. And in the Renaissance, it's what? It's a revival of, in mostly Western Europe, but and especially England, Greek thinking, Greek philosophy, Greek poetry, Greek architecture, Greek art. Why? Because this is the highest form of civilization. And if you are a classicist even today, that's what you major in. And if you don't think the United States was interested in that as it was founded and being formed, you've never been to Washington, D.C. So, and there are 2 movements that come out of during this Renaissance period. The Enlightenment, right? And the Enlightenment doubles down on Platonic dualism, perhaps most succinctly expressed by René Descartes, who said, he is a soul, but merely has a body. Other Enlightenment thinkers include men such as John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Rousseau, Adam Smith, Kant, Francis Bacon, Thomas Jefferson. They double down on this, and these are all we consider wonderful, great philosophers, but they're all dualists. And the Protestant Reformation was the second twin born during the Renaissance. The Reformation was heavily influenced by Platonic dualism, with doctrines teaching the separation of spirit and body, the primacy of the individual, orthodoxy over orthopraxis. Correct doctrine becomes so important that religious people in Europe began to kill each other and war against each other over whose doctrine was most correct. I used to have a bumper sticker. It finally faded off. That said, what was it? Something about Jesus. Which enemies did Jesus say to kill, or something like that? You know. So, and then of course it moves to the Americas, right? And Aristotle's theory of natural slaveability was taken up by 16th century Spanish theologian Sepulveda, who defends Spain's right to enslave and colonize the indigenous people of the West Indies. And so it comes to the shores. So I want to go over mostly just dualism now, and then just very briefly all the other sort of subsidiaries of dualism, because we just don't have time to go into that. But dualism, Platonic dualism, is the foundational fallacy in the Western worldview. It invests in the ethereal, the spiritual, the metaphysical, the abstract realm to a higher degree than the physical. Our thoughts and our theologies become disembodied. Nobody has that problem, right? Secular sacred split as a result of that. Believe God is at work in the church more than in the world. The physical, the land, our good works, the body all become suspect. It creates binary thinking, either right or wrong, or illegal or illegal, or heaven or hell, or sin or holiness, success or failure, civilized or primitive, introvert or extrovert, saved or lost, clean or dirty, weeds or plants, animals or varmints. We live in a binary world, according to that worldview, making it difficult for Western thinkers to hold two seemingly incompatible things in tension without having to find a resolution, creating the false assumption that all things may be understood and every problem solved. In other words, gut theory, grand unifying theory. And then these are just some of the subsidiaries, hierarchies. Once you begin to rank reality in a hierarchy, everything comes under hierarchy. Equality is wrong, or at least, thought to be not as preferable. Anthropocentrism, like superiority over the earth, white supremacy, patriarchy, etc. We can create whatever hierarchies we need. Compartmentalization, creating extrinsic, often unrelated categories that are partial reality. We spoke of this. Individualism. So individualism, for example, reading the scripture as this is for me instead of this is for we, but it wasn't written for me. It was written for people who cared more about the we. The me is a byproduct of the we. Utopianism, living for another world in the future or in the past. I try to lead to eventual destruction. The nature of a closed system is to collapse in on itself or to be consumed by other more adaptive systems. The nature of open systems is to adapt. And I don't know if you've noticed what kind of building that is down there, but I think we all know now. Adaptation. Order is the reality of planning and perseverance in sustainable systems. Order works with entropy, not against it, building open, adaptable systems of unity and diversity. Chaos is attempting to fight entropy through unsustainable, closed, homogeneous, non-adaptive systems. Climate change, zoonosis, which is, disease jumping from animals to people, many diseases like COVID, are a result of the Western world's rejection of creation's natural laws given by Creator. Nature adapts to survive. Under the present circumstances, the final adaptation of nature is human extinction. We only have a short time to come back from our own unsustainable chaos and back to Creator's sustainable order. And we don't know what's going to happen, but we know we're in trouble. And that's all we really need to know. For millennia, the whole creation has been producing enough energy to allow humans limited consumption. Humanity, in just a few generations, has accelerated consumption exponentially, the Anthropocene or the Europatricene. Mother Earth is now trying to rebalance the overuse through random acts of nature. She is reclaiming her territory, spitting out the inhabitants, to use a biblical phrase, in order to restore harmony. The top of the food chain is now Grandmother Earth herself, which sounds a lot like a horror movie. But we need to fix the world. In a Western Enlightenment worldview, human beings can be categorized apart from creation. The result is a false dichotomy between the physical earth and spiritual beings. In a harmony worldview, human beings are understood as fully physical and fully spiritual, and the earth is fully human, or fully spiritual and fully physical. Healing, therefore, by definition, should always consider the healing of people, the healing of our history, like colonial, neo-colonial systems, and the healing of all creation. All of creation is sacred, and there's a problem with worldview when one is considered sacred and not the other. People can still embody the whole of ourselves to fix the world. But it's messy. It's not very comfortable. But there are a lot of rewards. Love is abundant, including peace, mercy, justice, hospitality, restitution, and a whole plethora of characteristics and expressions for the common good, and for which the byproduct is also the good of individuals. The harmony way, which, by the way, my dissertation was on this idea of this harmony way construct. 45 tribes in just about every area of North America were interviewed and surveyed, and they all had a harmony way construct, all with different names, of course. So I used the harmony way to express all of them. They're very close to what Walter Brueggemann would describe as shalom in Scripture. The harmony way can be clearly identified, and it is communal in nature, not being satisfied to just seek the good of the individual, but seeks the common good, and it benefits the whole community in identifiable and tangible ways. And so I ask, could it be that great mystery, God, is the most vulnerable being who exists? If God is love, and love means vulnerability, then God must represent the essence of vulnerability. In Creator's vulnerability, we are invited to become fellow human beings with others who are different from us, to exchange and empower dignity in ourselves and others, to join in a reciprocal conversion of each other's understanding of truth, and to live with, for, and among the community of creation, including people, in harmony. The opposite of vulnerability is superficiality. The opposite of vulnerability is indifference. The opposite is control, including the illegitimate use of power. The misuse of power is among the primary failures of colonizer religion. So steps, where do we go? Adaptability, open systems. Well, how do you change structures that are bent on homeostasis in the open systems? Well, all I say is if you don't, they will fall in on themselves eventually, or something else will take them over. That's nature. Intentionality, no longer passive. Inclusive group experiences, no longer just homogeneous. Education by BIPOC, no longer your comfort zone. Exploring and embracing diversity narratives, no longer monocultural white myths. Racially diverse leadership, sharing power, no longer tokenism. Self-deprecating humor, no longer taking ourselves too seriously, which is one of our native values, by the way, So I'm going to tell you a secret, but you can't tell anybody, okay? So one of the things Native people say about white people all the time is like, well, why do they take themselves so seriously? You know? Like, we're all just human beings. And embodied, empowered churches and congregations as centers of proactive change, no longer dualistic. Oh, I guess it's time for me to go. Well, you know, that's better than it's better than a crook.
Exactly. That was your hour mark right there.
So I guess there's no stopping that, but yeah. So I guess somebody didn't want to see me say no longer milquetoast congregations. So, we can end it right there. That's an hour. That's fine. I'm happy that I've said enough for you to think about. So is there a moderator? We want to take some discussion.
And for them to have a good experience in hearing the questions, I'm going to pass the microphone around to folks who have questions. So raise your hand. Wonderment?
You can also have comments. That's okay.
Yeah. Questions, comments?
Hi, I'm Ryan. We haven't met before, but it's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
In your comments, it seemed like you had a critique on the relationship that we have with animals as food source. And what I was wondering is, do you have any practical advice or guidelines that you'd like to offer about how we eat, recognizing that not all of us have the land or the experience to farm and do our own food, right?
Yeah.
Cultivate our own food.
You know, there's some great organizations out there, you know, who have a lot of that advice. But of course, you know, I mean, I have a lot of little suggestions like, let's begin to treat, because we need really less cattle. Like that's one of the big problems, right? So, you know, let's treat beef like we do scallops and lobster, you know. So let's make it the food for, you know, like special occasions and you know, those kinds of things. Let's understand, this is getting at the worldview again. We have to understand that we have a relationship with our food that is missing. When, you know, we were at Ghost Ranch in New Mexico, and my wife Edith and I were they'd asked us at this conference of elders and things to come in and speak to the youth for an hour. And so Edith got up and she said to these, I don't know, were there 70, 80 probably young people, mostly ages like 10 to 14. She said, where does your food come from? Of course, it was quiet, right? That's the age to not say anything. And then she kind of pushed them, and finally they start saying, well, like, from my mom, from the grocery store, from, you know, no one. I mean, they went around and around and around, and no one said, like, from a farm, until finally this one young lady, and she was probably the youngest one there. I was so proud of her. She said, it comes from Mother Earth. And it's like there's this missing relationship that we have from our food. You know, there's this wonderful saying that goes, it says, all of my food has wings, fins, feet, you know, and it goes through that sort of thing to realize that, and they're all my relatives, right? So there's a way to farm. There's a way to gain a relationship back, even if, you know, like I talk to people and I say, they say, well, how do I get started? I live in an apartment, you know, with a balcony, and I'm like, do you like tomatoes? Yeah, grow a tomato, you know? Grow the tomato and save the seeds. And then, you know what? Share a tomato with your neighbor and then give them some seeds and then tell them to grow some. Now, all of a sudden, we're a part of the system, right? Rather than seeing the system as separate from us. And so we have to find ways to become relatives again with our food. And there are people who raise animals and everything sustainably and with kindness. Now we've raised sort of everything, cattle, horses, sheep, goats, chickens, etc. And I've had people who are vegetarian and vegan come and actually interview us and say, we want to understand, like, you kill your animals. And I'm like, yes, we kill them ceremonially, and they live a good life, a wonderful life, actually, up until about the last 6 seconds. But I got to tell you that right now we only raise chickens, and we raise them for eggs, and that's kind of a good thing right now. And I was so relieved to not have to kill animals anymore, because it really does take something out of it. So it's just a lot of work that we have to do. In the Western worldview, it's not going to get us there. We're going to have to, an indigenous worldview or another worldview that understands, like, our relationship to these things and our relationship to our food has to actually become real rather than objectifying and commodifying it.
Thank you so much. We do have a question online.
All right, so this is from Michael Saxton. Our question is, much of Christianity is based on dualism. That seems to be a very different approach to the vision of God that you articulated. Can you please comment?
Based on what?
Dualism?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Can I comment on?
On your vision of God that's different from this dualism. If I'm seeing that right.
So, I don't ask anybody to believe my belief, but my belief is that God, creator, great mystery, is the most vulnerable being who exists. And God hurts with us when we hurt, and every person on earth, and laughs with us when we laugh, and extends grace to us when we think we can't, and does all kinds of things. But and the strength that it takes to show that kind of weakness is almost unfathomable. And that's who God is to me. And God is concerned about not just people, and certainly not just souls. God is concerned about healing the whole community of creation, including people, and on this earth.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. It's just wonderful to hear and to get to sit with you and learn from you today. Your comments about God or great mystery creator being the most vulnerable being in existence, I think are fascinating. I think are powerful. And I guess a question, I took a picture of your slide. My memory's not that good. So you talked here about how it kind of bears for us an invitation to join into reciprocal conversion of each other's understanding of truth. Mm-hmm. Can you just speak to, especially in light of the to put it mildly, the messy dynamics of how conversion has been weaponized in the past, what that mutual reciprocal conversion looks like, and how that plays out?
Yeah. So when I used to teach missiology, I had this thing. It's probably the most formal thing I ever did. I had Dr. Woodley's 10 missiological imperatives. And they began with, there's no place that we can go where God is not present and active. And if we are supposed to be humble followers of Jesus, then our role is to first convert to the truths wherever we find them of others. And you get way down to like 8 or 9, and then it says, if you're asked, you can share your truth. But then that conversion is not your business unless you're asked for it to be. And so that's a very different form of missiology. I know you're studying in missiological school at Fuller. But just all my life, I've been around diversity, racial, ethnic, religious. I had wonderful experience throughout my life. I produced a television show here in Denver from 1980 to 83 called House of the Lord. And I'm sure there's no one out there who remembers that. I think it was for ABC, Public Service Program. And I worked for the Denver Rabbinical Council, the Colorado Council of Churches, the Archdiocese of Denver, Interfaith Communications International, and East Denver Ministerial Alliance. And that was really an education for me in terms of interreligious dialogue. And I had to produce a show every week that either drew everyone together to talk about that subject, or we individually had to sort of give time to everybody to talk on the subject. So that was an education. We were until recently, we were part of a group in the state of Oregon called the Common Table, in which it was a complete interfaith group, and we got together. And at first, our thing was like, what can we all do together? But after a while, it was just sort of like, why don't we just get to know one another, and listen to each other's truths. And that enriched my life so much, those kind of interfaith experiences. And so, we need to be willing to convert to the truths that others see, because that's just part of diversity. That's the beauty of it.
We have a question here.
Thank you for being at Iliff and in Denver this week. We're grateful to have you. I'm really intrigued by yours and Edith's approach that worldviews can shift and change over time. In other settings I've encountered that worldviews are something that are really difficult, if almost impossible to change because of how much we are steeped in them, not just in our lifetime, but from all we inherit from those who went before us. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about your experience of worldviews shifting over time, either in a lifetime or in a multi-generational lifetime.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Brian, for that question. So, in the old days, right, anthropologists thought worldviews were immutable, couldn't be moved. Now they just disagree with those old findings, and in fact, they believe that people can have multiple worldviews. Especially as we're doing globalization and everything. And they call that indigenous cosmopolitanism, to coin a phrase. And I thought about that, when I read the book, Indigenous Cosmopolitanism. And I thought, women have had to operate with two worldviews for so long, just to make it in the quote-unquote man's world, So, I mean, it's like, because anthropologists were mostly men, that's why they didn't catch on to that a long time ago, right? But we can. And so my wife and I were raised in two very different situations. I was raised in a very mixed blood, assimilated family, and she was raised on the reservation in a more traditional family. But when we came together, we realized we had a lot of the same values because...
So how do people who are racialized as white stay accountable for the line between lowercase indigenizing and uppercase indigenous appropriation, theft, and exploitation?
Mm-hmm. And I think you know the answer to that.
Yeah, but it's not for me.
Yeah, because I liked earlier in class that what you said. You said if you don't want to appropriate another culture, you have to do the proper permissions in another culture. In other words, in our native way, we know that everything we do, if it's not something that was directly given to us, we have to ask permission, right? And so, and then you're given permission by the right people to do stuff, and you have to be accountable. And someone comes up and says, "Hey, where did you learn to do this?" Like, for example, let's just say Sweat Lodge. So people have asked me, like, well, I've been running Sweat for over 30 years. My wife's been running it for just under 30 years. And I've had people say, where did you get your Sweat? Well, I was given Sweat by the Southern Cheyenne people. They asked a Comanche guy, Ken Kusawan, to teach. He was taught by Wallace Black Elk. He was taught by Black Elk. I have a line of succession that I can say, here's where I got this, right? If you can't do that, or if it's an illegitimate source, then you're disreputed. You, and it's that sense of privilege that you're really speaking to that, and I'm going to tell a story here. This is kind of, I told earlier in class, but I think it's worthwhile. So there's an old Comanche man. He was 93 years old that I used to visit. His name was Robert Coffey. This was back in the early 90s. I'd go to Lawton, Oklahoma, and I'd spend time with him, take him out to lunch. And he was kind of a character, blind in one eye. He drove this big Buick. He drove every Friday night to the high school basketball games, and everybody knew who he was. And so I'd just go and sit with him. And he says to me one time, he says, Randy, do you know, like at a powwow, and we have a giveaway, right? And a Native person will just come up and thank you, shake your hand, say thank you, and mean it. But you ever notice like what white people do? And I'm like, yeah, it's kind of different. He said, yeah, they'll, hug you and shake your hand and shake it several times. And it might even be that great a gift, but it's just like, overdo it, right? And he says, you know why that is? And no, I don't know. What is this 93-year-old Native man who's lived through boarding schools and his parents were born on the plains in a teepee before white people ever came? What is he going to tell me? And he said, that's because a white person does not ever want to owe anything to an Indian. And so that speaks to that idea of privilege somehow. What people have to learn is like, if you want something, if you want help in the Native community or with something like that, you have to actually go and say, I need your help, and then offer tobacco or some kind of gift. That's how we have to do it, and that's how everybody has to do it. Otherwise, it's appropriation. Yeah.
I think we have time for one last question or comment.
I'll add my thanks to all the others and just ask if you could describe a little bit about what educational programming looks like on Iliff at the farm.
Yeah. So let's drop the word programming because it's not programmed. Maybe it's programmed, but not very well. So basically, there are 4 of us who teach our schools. The schools are 4 days. They come in, they're together day and night. One of our former students here, I should probably just have him tell you what it's like. And then Edith and I, and then Jim Sakura, who's a Hawaiian elder, and Lenore Three Stars, who's a Lakota elder. The 4 of us take different times, sometimes together, sometimes separate, and we'll sit around the fire, or we'll sit under the oak tree, or wherever it's at, around the wood stove if it's cold inside or whatever. And we'll share things. There's no PowerPoint presentations. There's we list what we hope are meal times because that seems to be important, But a lot of times we don't make those. And then it just sort of goes from there. It's like, okay, Jim, you're up, And then he does his thing for an hour or 2. And then Edith, you're up. And then she does her thing. And I don't know what the secret is, but I know that it works. And people leave and, and I'm like all of us ask each other, like, what's going on here? Why are people being touched so deeply and being changed? And we get letters back all the time saying my whole worldview has shifted and now I'm doing something different and, all this kind of stuff. And none of us quite figure it out. But whatever it is, unprogrammed, we're just going to keep doing it, So, yeah. A lot of storytelling. Yeah. Anything you want to add, Gregory?
I can just offer my 2 cents that it is a fantastic experience, and we went up with a whole group of students, and everyone left really hungry for more and wanting to see more people engaging in a slowed down, story-centered, transformative space. So.
Or maybe it's because the last night we all go to karaoke together. That could be the secret. So, yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Oh, I'll finish now.
We may not, as white people, want to be in your debt, but we are in your debt. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, those of you online, those of you watching later, for joining us this evening. Have a good evening.